Mike Meakin. He's the Vice President for Global Quality and Regulatory Affairs at DHL Supply Chain. And he is also one of the members of the GS1 Healthcare leadership team since many years. And among different things that Mike has done, he has been working on implementing traceability projects with DHL around the world using the GS1 system and bringing around the good practices that he could have seen from one country to another. Mike, thank you very much for dialing in with us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm just hoping I've got the navigation of the slides right. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, to everyone around the world. I'm going to take you through what DHL's been doing with creating its supply chains and optimizing them for the pandemic. I'll quickly do this by giving you a bit of background about what we call PIP. I'm going to give a quick resume about what we did last year when the pandemic kicked off. And also, I'm going to give a bit more focus around the actual vaccines as opposed to a lot of the main materials on the medical devices like PPE and diagnostics materials, but I will cover those as well. And it's going to kick off with when the pandemic started. We were having to build freezer farms. We were having to design new logistics models and implement solutions virtually as we speak. So it's a bit like we've just heard about what happened in Thailand. I'm going to give a bit of an overview of what we've been doing and how we've been using GS1 standards throughout that. So with the main products, using the GTINs, those countries that use GLNs for location and traceability, it's to sort of take you through that journey. So very briefly on DHL and who we are, we're an organization of 5 big divisions, and we're actually owned by the German Post Office, which is one of the divisions. But the 3 main ones that were involved in and currently involved in the pandemic is our Express, our parcel carrier that has been flying vaccines all over the world direct into vaccine centers. We've then got our global forwarding air and ocean freight business, which uses the network, as you see in the center of the slide, through all of those different countries, and sort of join the dots between the manufacturers and all of their CMOs, and then bring the goods into the supply chain. And then the part of the business that I work in, which is known as supply chain, which is the traditional 3PL warehousing and distribution. So what we did initially was we dust off our PIP, or pandemic plans. And PIP stands for Pandemic Influenza Preparation Plans or Preparedness Plans. The key thing was when this pandemic kicked off, we weren't dealing with flu, but all of our plans that we had in the business about being able to organize our workforce, our people, our equipment were built around some of these plans. So, and a lot of those countries that 15 years ago, based on WHO guidance on having plans for different types of flus, were being dusted off. And that is where we started implementing and dealing with the pandemic. And then by the sort of middle to the end of last year, because of the new vaccines that were being going through their final trials, etc., we were then very much into planning, talking to the industry and putting our white papers, etc., together. The key thing which we picked up early last year, or in the summer of last year, was this was very much about temperature was going to be a big challenge. So like identity of the product in the supply chain being key and being able to trace it, that we had this big hurdle to sort of think about, well, how are we going to handle such high volumes at, let's say, temperatures of -70, because it was quite clear some of the earlier vaccines that would come in. And we were already at this point shipping materials around the globe between different manufacturers. We had an idea that this was going to be a challenge. So we were having to find new ways of being able to monitor the temperatures, new ways of being able to pack the temperatures for longer and at lower temperatures. And as you can see in the bottom photograph of one of our sites where we had about 10 ultra low temperature freezers, we were building freezer farms where we would now have up to 150 of those special ULT freezers so we could handle vaccines at -70. The other thing that we were also aware from our white papers and all of the other information we were picking up, there were a number of vaccines that looked to be coming to, into the supply chain and getting to the markets. We had in the light blue, low-income countries, we had the high-income countries where a lot of the vaccines were targeted, as well as the dark blue, which is the global entity. And it was quite obvious by the end of last year, so we're only talking a matter of 3 or 4 months ago, we realized the impact this was going to have on air freight, and that air freight having to be able to operate at such low temperatures. Because the key thing is we didn't have the capacity then, and we had to build the capacity and design new ways of moving the vaccines. It was quite clear from a lot of the studies that we would need probably now in the range of at least 12 billion vaccines to be able to cover the world's population of about 8 billion people. And it was obvious early on, most of the vaccines, until we got to the single shot vaccines, which are still just starting to come in across the globe. Most of the vaccines we're talking about, you need 2 doses. So as a result, this is where you get to the figure of the high figure that the world needs over the next coming years to vaccinate a lot of people, and the supply chains to be able to handle this are quite unique. The other thing most people will be aware, because we're all living and breathing this, is if you look at the thermometer on the left and you look at some of the vaccines that have come to market, and most of these have, or at the time we were looking at this, we were sort of planning. We had those first mRNA vaccines that came in, needed to be kept at -70, and then some at what you'd call very low temperatures or deep frozen. But most of the vaccines, when we were getting them into the supply chain, it was more around handling at a traditional temperature in the cold chain of 2 to 8 degrees centigrade. What DHL had to do was it came up with, it needed 3 different types of supply chains. And a lot of this was having to be designed using our global standards and our traditional methods of shipping products. But it comes back to our 3 different business units, because the first supply chain was very much what we called the direct, where we were flying in vaccines direct into countries, and those countries would virtually be taking those vaccines straight to their, almost straight to the vaccination centers, whether it be we flew it in at -70 or it then went through the country process. The next one was a combination of hybrids, which we call, cross-docking vaccines. And it's quite interesting how we touch these vaccines at different points. So if I take somewhere like Spain, for instance, we might not handle the main vaccine, but when it arrives in Madrid, we would then be handling the cross-dock. So that would be a particular model I know quite well that we've been doing. And in this particular case, what we would call the customer or the person giving us the direction, we class as public sector. It's the government we're working for. Whereas in the first model, we're working direct with the manufacturers. And then the third model is more our traditional 3PL network, where we are working at a local level, delivering the vaccines into the country. Again, working either with the local governments or with under the manufacturer's requirements, and the data we then feed into them, our GTINs and everything else that we're scanning, then get fed back into everybody else's network. So we're talking about interoperability and traceability. So a nice sort of picture which sort of describes this, you can see, is this sort of shows, you know, we're covering vaccines all across different continents. We've been handling them through different sort of temperatures. And one of the other things, unfortunately, I can't go and spend a lot of time, but you know, you can't underestimate the security with some of these vaccines, and the fact that you know, not only security from trying to prevent counterfeiting and using the standards there, but there were also other challenges, even if I throw in things like insurance and having to use escort vehicles, or you working with the military in a lot of countries around the globe, and so forth. But that slide just shows how DHL operates as a supplier handling the COVID-19 vaccines. So one quick deep dive into the direct model. This shows where we're operating out of the Benelux, and we're using the direct model. And here we're talking about trying to keep the vaccines at their appropriate temperatures. And you can see the sort of flow on the right-hand side. And this is where it's important, again, with our global GS1 standards, of being able to track what's happening and synchronize the data that is getting back from our shipments, so that all of the key players can see where these vaccines are, they're being traced, and as a result can respond accordingly. So that sort of takes us to the early part of the year. You know, we were handling some of the very first vaccines just before the new year. They sort of arrived in our warehouse. One of the interesting things was that as soon as they were arriving, they were going out. And there were phrases being used like it was important about jabs in arms and not jabs in on shelves in freezers or fridges. You know, this was moving at a rapid pace. And when we first set up all of the ULTs, for instance, we found they were hardly going in the ULTs, they were going straight out on aircraft. And the good news is I was just amazed just how quickly we were able to get all across the world these vaccines moving through the supply chain. And generally speaking, that moved quite smoothly, but I will come on to a couple of issues on the traceability, which shows the benefits of doing this, where we captured some products that when we were scanning them didn't have the appropriate barcodes on them. But I'm talking here tiny percent, but the good thing is the system worked. So, so at the beginning of the year, we're now actually live and we're handling a number of the vaccines. But the other thing is also to be mindful of, there's a lot of new stuff on the horizon. There were newer therapies, there are more vaccines coming out, as we can see. And the other thing that I haven't spent much time talking about, or I want to just raise it on the next two slides, is the amount of diagnostics that's going on and around the world with a number of companies where we're also in DHL putting together a lot of the kits. So we're breaking those bulk packs and turning them into the kits needed. And that also includes ancillaries. So it's not just the vaccine, we've got to get the syringes and all of the other materials as well to the vaccination centres. So it is a really huge, complex supply chain. And the key takeaway here is, whilst the vaccine uses, and we're talking here, you know, billions of vaccines going by air and by road, and the amount of tonnage, when you actually look at the ancillaries being used as well, it is amazing to see that the challenges we have with air freight, just also to move the ancillaries and the diagnostics to these locations too. So that is also taken, and one of the things I was really pleased, whilst we were delivering vaccines into January and February, we were actually sort of like flying stuff that I was aware of from, let's say, Korea into the Netherlands, and from the Netherlands, we were then flying vaccines to a lot of the COVAX countries and to the partners and NGOs that you can see on this picture, to over 100 countries from the Netherlands. So it was great to see we were flying into the Philippines, Mongolia, another place to use these different models I've described. We're also looking at a number of very high level, well, not high level, but detailed innovations. And that is one of the things that we're currently doing. And this takes us into more the detail of using GS1 standards. And that is we're doing postponement manufacturing. It's amazing to think we've gone through the trials, we've now got the vaccines out there, but now the other thing we're looking at doing is handling nude vials and actually then labeling them. But what we're talking about here is taking vaccines from -70, warming them up to room temperature, relabeling and packaging them, and then taking them back down to the required temperatures for storage and then distributing them. More on this later, but this is a fascinating project which will help us ramp up and do even more creative things by using GS1 standards for the industry. So to summarize, this has been a rapid roller coaster journey. It's amazing. We've only just first went into lockdown about a year ago, and now we've got vaccines out. And when we first did our pandemic plans, we were told it could take us years to get vaccines. And it's amazing we've done it in we've done it in months. And we've also managed to create new supply chains and deliver those very quickly within, sometimes days or weeks or days. It's just been amazing. Some countries also we work with adopted their standard supply chain models. So there was no sort of paradigm, this is the way to do it. Some countries says you've got to work with our military. And I'm amazed, like in one part of Europe, we have a country's army collect the vaccines. They then take it to a DHL warehouse where we have the ULTs in another country. And then we ship the vaccines from that country to either back to the military or back direct to vaccination centers. It's amazing in how many countries the military are involved and how one has to engage again with new players and partners in the logistics. The ULTs, I was worried with this type of solution because we could see it was more a short-term, medium-term. But the good thing is this is opening up so many other new opportunities because we've got that infrastructure, which might be a radical change for other, whether it be gene therapy, medicines, or other types of ventures. So the good news is I think a lot of positive things will come out of that. Just a couple of other things I would like to just reinforce is probably the work that we're doing around postponement manufacturing and how GS1 standards play a vital impact there. And we're also, as part of that, looking at serialization of the vaccines. So we're going not just by having the GTIN, etc., and tracking the lot and expiry, but it's ensuring that we do have these the serial number. One other thing I have picked up with the vaccines, a number of use cases and a lot of development where barcodes are being used for expiry dates. And there are a couple of vaccine producers where when you scan the vaccine, you can then get information about that particular product. So that's something which I think is going to be an interesting development going forward. And the final thing before I wrap up, I just wanted to say was there was only been one occasion I'm aware of where when we were handling the vaccines in, we had to operate those ULT fridge farms like a Formula One pit stop. We were against the clock because when you open those doors, you've got to keep them closed for another 25 minutes for them to regain their temperature. It is a rapid dynamic process operating with ULTs. But So it's a case of the scanning was done more on the outbound. It was a case of keeping the products at the right temperature. But when we did come to scan on the outbound, we did come across on one occasion where the products didn't have lot and expiry dates on the outer packaging. But the good news was on the eaches, or the vial, individual vials did, and that was great. So, you know, the scanning worked and it prevented any issue and it demonstrated we're in control. So thank you, and I'll be taking any questions later.
Thank you very much, Mike, for this explanation how DHL is helping really to bring the important vaccines to patients everywhere in the world.